The morning sun rose over the green valleys of New Busan like it did every other day. Children walked to school along dirt roads between tall grain fields. Farmers checked their crops. Miners rode transport shuttles toward the mountains where they dug for rare metals that Earth needed. It was a peaceful world, far from the center of the galaxy, and the people who lived there liked it that way. They were simple people who had left Earth to build something new. 4.2 million of them called this planet home. They had built cities with markets and parks. They had hospitals, libraries, and small temples on hilltops. It was not a rich colony, but it was a happy one. Nobody on New Busan knew what was about to happen. At exactly noon local time, the sky turned dark. Not from clouds, from ships. Dozens of massive warships dropped out of hyperspace directly above the planet. They were black and covered in heavy armor plates, and their hulls were carved with the sharp markings of the Dreth Dominion. The Dreth were one of the oldest military empires in the galaxy. They were a reptilian species, tall and cold-blooded in every sense of the word. They had ruled their part of space for thousands of years, and they did not like that humans, a species barely 2 centuries old in space, were spreading so fast and so far. There was no warning, no message, no demand. The Dreth fleet simply opened fire. The first shots hit the capital city of Hanem. Bright beams of energy fell from orbit like pillars of white fire, and where they touched the ground, everything turned to ash. Buildings melted, streets cracked open. People who were walking, eating, laughing 1 second were gone the next. The orbital bombardment spread outward from Hanem to the surrounding towns and farming communities. Fires rose so high they could be seen from space. The colony had no real military. There was a small garrison of a few hundred soldiers, led by a retired officer named Kwon Min-ho. He was 63 years old and had come to New Busan to live quietly after decades of service. When the first explosions shook the ground, he ran to the garrison command center and tried to activate the planetary shield. It had been offline for maintenance. He swore, then ordered his soldiers to begin emergency evacuation of civilians into the underground mining tunnels. It was all he could do. Evacuation ships tried to launch from the spaceport. The Dreth shot them down, one by one. Each explosion in the sky was another few hundred lives lost. Min-ho watched from the ground, his hands shaking, and gave the order to stop all launches. There was no escape by air. The only hope was underground. Thousands of people ran toward the mine entrances in the mountains. Old people were helped along by strangers. The Dreth did not target the mines directly, perhaps because they did not care about them, or perhaps because they wanted some survivors to carry the message of what had happened here. The bombardment lasted 72 hours, 3 full days and nights of fire falling from the sky. By the end, the green valleys were black, the cities were flattened, the rivers boiled dry. The air was filled with smoke and dust so thick that the sun could not be seen. Far away at a deep space listening post near the edge of human territory, a young intelligence officer named Shin Eun-ji sat at her monitoring station. She had been on a routine shift, scanning for unusual signals, when her console lit up with emergency alerts. She adjusted her equipment and pulled in the signal from New Busan. First came the audio, screaming and crying and the sound of explosions. Then came the visual feed from the colony's security cameras. She watched buildings collapse. She watched people running and falling. She watched children looking up at the sky with wide, confused eyes before the light swallowed them. Eun-ji's hands went still on the console. Her face did not move. She recorded everything. Every second. Every frame. Then she encrypted the files and sent them directly to Earth Command with the highest priority tag she had authority to use. She added a single note to the transmission. It read only, "New Busan is gone." When the Dreth fleet finally pulled away from the burning world, they left behind a broadcast in Galactic Common, the shared language of all spacefaring species. The message was short. It said, "Let this remind the young species to know their place." On the surface below, the survivors began crawling out of the mine tunnels. There were barely 400,000 of them. Many were injured. Many were in shock. They walked out into a world they did not recognize. Where there had been fields, there was only scorched earth. Where there had been homes, there was rubble. The sky was gray and orange with smoke. Kwon Minho stood at the entrance of the largest tunnel and looked out across what had been the Haenam Valley. He had lived here for 8 years. He had known many of the dead by name. He was a soldier. He had seen death before. But not like this. Never like this. His legs gave out, and he sat down on the blackened ground and stared at nothing for a long time. The news reached Earth within hours. At first there was disbelief, then confirmation, then silence. A heavy, terrible silence that spread across every city and every station in human space. News screens showed the footage that Unji had captured. People watched in their homes, in their offices, in the streets. Some cried, some could not speak, some turned away. But many did not cry and did not turn away. They watched every second. And something changed behind their eyes. The leaders of Earth held an emergency session that lasted through the night. Generals spoke. Diplomats spoke. Scientists spoke. When it was over, the President of the United Earth Government walked to a podium and said only 6 words to the press. "We have received the Council's invitation." It was a lie. The Galactic Accord Council had sent no invitation, but one would come soon, because the galaxy had just made the worst mistake in its long history. It had touched something it should not have touched. And now, in the quiet offices and dark shipyards of human space, a machine was beginning to turn. Not fast, not loud, but unstoppable. The Galactic Accord Council met on a neutral space station called Paruan Spire. It was an enormous structure that floated between star systems, far from any single species' territory. And it had served as the meeting place for the galaxy's 42 recognized civilizations for over 6,000 years. Its halls were tall enough for the largest species to walk through comfortably, and its chambers were designed so that every representative, no matter their shape or size, could be seen and heard equally. It was meant to be a place of fairness. That was the idea, at least. 2 weeks after the burning of New Busan, Yoon Nari walked through those halls alone. She was Earth's chief diplomat to the Galactic Embassy. She was a small woman, barely 160 centimeters tall, with short black hair and a calm face that gave away nothing. She wore a dark gray suit with no decorations. In her hand she carried a single data chip. She had not slept more than a few hours in the past 14 days. She did not look tired. She looked like someone who had moved past tiredness into something else entirely. The council chamber was already full when she entered. Representatives from dozens of species sat in their assigned places. Some were insectoid, with many eyes and thin legs. Some were large, furred creatures from heavy gravity worlds. Some were aquatic beings inside water-filled travel suits. At the center of the raised platform sat Elder Voron, the head speaker of the council. He was tall, even by alien standards, with a hard exoskeleton the color of dark copper, and 4 long arms that he folded neatly in front of him. He had held his position for over 90 years, and was known for his careful, measured words. Voron opened the session with a speech. He called the attack on New Busan a regrettable incident and an unfortunate escalation in a border region. He acknowledged the loss of life, but reminded the chamber that conflict between species is not unknown in galactic history. and urged all parties to respond with wisdom rather than emotion. He suggested that the council form a special committee to investigate the matter and begin reparations negotiations with the Dreth Dominion. Several other species spoke after him. The representative from the Ilari Collective expressed sympathy, but warned that military retaliation would destabilize the trade corridors. The Morvine ambassador said that the Dreth had been a partner in galactic governance for millennia, and that hasty action would harm everyone. One by one, they spoke, and one by one, they said the same thing in different words. Calm down. Be patient. Accept a committee. Accept talks. Accept that this is how the galaxy works. Nari listened to all of it without moving. When the last speaker finished, Voron turned to her and offered her the floor. She stood. The chamber went quiet. Every eye and sensor and organ of perception in the room focused on the small human woman standing alone on the open floor. She did not give a speech. She held up the data chip and asked for it to be played on the chamber's main display. Voron hesitated, then allowed it. The footage began. It was the raw, unedited recording from New Busan's security systems, the same footage that Shin and Ji had captured and sent to Earth. The chamber saw the Dreth ships appear in the sky. They saw the first beams of light strike the capital city. They saw buildings collapse. They saw people running through the streets, carrying children, falling, burning. They heard screaming. They saw a school break apart and fold inward. They saw a hospital hit directly, its walls turning to liquid glass. They saw an evacuation shuttle rise 100 meters before a Dreth weapon tore it in half. And they saw the bodies fall from the sky like rain. The footage lasted 12 minutes. By the end, some of the alien representatives had turned away. A few had covered their sensory organs. The Ilari delegates' color patterns, which indicated emotional state, had gone completely white. But others sat unmoved. The Morvine ambassador watched with flat, unbothered eyes. Voron's expression, to the extent that his insectoid face could show one, did not change. When the footage ended, Nari let the silence sit for 10 full seconds. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady and clear. 3.8 million people. That is how many died on New Busan. They were farmers. They were miners. They were teachers and children and old people who wanted to live quietly. They had no fleet. They had no weapons. They had done nothing to the Dreth Dominion. Nothing. She paused and looked around the room. And now this council asks us to sit in a committee room and negotiate. You ask us to wait for reparations that will take decades. You ask us to be calm. You ask us to be wise. She lowered her hand and held the data chip at her side. We came here to see if the galaxy had a conscience. Now we know. She bowed, a short and formal bow, and then she said the words that would be remembered for centuries. Earth will handle this alone. She turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, the chamber erupted. Voron called her name. Other delegates shouted. Some demanded she return. Some called for an emergency vote. Nari did not stop. She did not turn around. She walked through the tall doors, and they closed behind her. And the sound of the shouting was cut off, like a light being switched off. Outside, she stood in the corridor for a moment. She closed her eyes. Her hands, which had been perfectly steady the entire time, were shaking now. She pressed them together until they stopped. Then she walked to her ship. On the way back to Earth, she sent a single encrypted message to Admiral Han Do-hyun. It contained 2 words, no justice. Do-hyun read the message in his office aboard Earth's orbital command station. He sat still for a long time after reading it. Then he opened a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder marked with a red stripe. On its cover were 2 words, Operation Autumn Storm. He had hoped he would never have to open it. He opened it now. Within the hour, orders went out to every corner of human space. They were quiet orders, sent through encrypted channels, read only by those with the highest clearance. No public announcements were made. No speeches were given. The president of United Earth simply appeared on the news that evening and said that Earth was evaluating all options, and that the people should trust that their government remembers what was done. Behind those calm words, the largest military operation in human history had just begun. For 3 months, Earth said nothing. Human trade ships still traveled the galactic lanes. Human ambassadors still attended minor council functions and smiled politely. Human stations still welcomed alien visitors and sold them coffee and music and the strange art that other species found so fascinating. To the rest of the galaxy, it seemed like humanity had accepted its loss and moved on. Some species even said privately that the humans had been put in their place, just as the Dreth intended. They were all wrong. In the deep shipyards hidden behind Earth's moon, in secret construction bays carved into asteroids across the solar system, and in classified military stations scattered through human space, something enormous was being built. Admiral Han Do-hyun stood at the center of it all, overseeing everything from Earth's orbital command station. He was a tall man of 57, with gray at his temples, and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. When Do-hyun spoke, people listened, because every word he said had been carefully chosen, and every order he gave had a reason behind it. The combined retaliation fleet was growing by the day. Over 400 warships were being assembled, supplied, armed, and crewed. Among them were 12 ships of a class that had never been deployed in combat. They were called the Dakiabi-class heavy dreadnoughts, and they were the most powerful warships humanity had ever created. Each one was over 2 kilometers long, armored in layered composite plating, and carried weapons that could crack a moon in half. They had been built in secret over the past decade, designed for a war that Earth hoped would never come. That hope was dead now. Captain Baek Ji-sok was given command of the Vanguard fleet. He was 39 years old, lean and sharp-eyed, and he had earned his reputation as one of the finest tactical minds in the Navy during the colony border wars 5 years earlier. His ship was the Hwasal, a fast assault cruiser whose name meant arrow in Korean. Ji-sok spent every waking hour running combat simulations. He studied Dreth fleet formations, their weapons ranges, their shield frequencies, their communication patterns. He ran the simulations hundreds of times, adjusting, adapting, finding weaknesses. His crew saw him eat at his command console. They saw him sleep in his chair for 20-minute stretches before waking and running another scenario. Nobody complained. They all knew what this was for. Shin Eun-ji, the intelligence officer who had first received the distress call from New Busan, had been pulled from her listening post and placed in charge of the intelligence operation for Autumn Storm. She was quiet by nature, the kind of person who noticed everything and said little. Now she led a team of 200 analysts who worked in a sealed facility beneath the surface of Mars. Their job was to map every piece of the Dreth military machine, every shipyard, every supply depot, every communication relay, every fleet position, every command structure, and most importantly, the exact location of Warlord Gal's flagship. Gal was the supreme commander of the Dreth fleets, and the one who had ordered the attack on New Busan. He was known across the galaxy as a brutal and arrogant leader who believed that strength was the only thing that mattered. Eun-ji studied him carefully. She read every intercepted communication, every intelligence report, every analysis of his past campaigns. She learned how he thought, how he reacted to threats, and where he liked to position his ships. By the end of the second month, she knew his patterns better than he did. Commander Kwon Tae-soon handled the ground forces. He was a broad-shouldered man of 45, with scars on his hands from close combat in 3 different campaigns. He trained his soldiers hard. The Dreth were physically larger and stronger than humans, with thick natural armor on their skin and claws that could tear through light body armor. Taesoon did not care. He drilled his soldiers in close-quarters combat techniques designed specifically for fighting Dreth. He taught them where the weak points in Dreth anatomy were, how to move fast enough to avoid their claws, and how to use the Dreth's size and aggression against them. His soldiers trained 18 hours a day. None of them asked for rest. While the military prepared, the Galactic Accord Council kept sending envoys to Earth. Every week, a new alien diplomat would arrive at the human embassy with a new proposal, a new committee idea, a new set of reparations terms. Every week, they were received politely. They were given comfortable rooms, good food, and pleasant conversation. And every week, they left with nothing. No agreements, no promises, no information. Nari handled each visit personally, and she gave away nothing. She smiled, she listened, she nodded, and she said words that sounded like answers, but contained no substance at all. Elder Voron sent private messages to Nari almost daily. His tone shifted over the weeks from confident to concerned to something close to afraid. He could feel that something was coming, but he could not see it. The humans had gone quiet in a way that made the older species of the galaxy very uncomfortable, because in their long experience, silence from a wounded species was never a good sign. One evening, 3 weeks before the fleet was scheduled to depart, Admiral Do-hyun left his command station and took a shuttle down to Earth's surface. He traveled to the city of Busan, the original Busan, the city on Earth that the lost colony had been named after. There, in a park near the ocean, a memorial wall had been erected. It was made of white stone and stretched for nearly a kilometer. On it were carved the names of every confirmed dead from the colony of New Busan. 3.8 million names. The wall was covered in flowers, photographs, letters, and small personal items left by families and friends. Do-hyun walked along the wall slowly. He was looking for specific names. He found them near the middle of the 3rd section, his younger sister. Their 2 children, ages 9 and 6. He had not seen them in 4 years. He had planned to visit them on New Busan the following summer. He stood in front of their names for a long time. He did not cry. He did not speak. He touched the carved letters with his fingertips, then lowered his hand, turned, and walked back to his shuttle. The next morning, he sent the final order. The fleet would depart in 20 days. All communications would go dark. No signals in or out. 412 warships, carrying 200,000 soldiers, would move through space like ghosts. And when they arrived, the Dreth Dominion would learn what humanity's silence had really meant. The Dreth Dominion had ruled its part of the galaxy for 4,000 years. In that time, no enemy had ever struck at the heart of their territory. Their borders were guarded by hundreds of warships, their systems were protected by orbital defense platforms, and their reputation alone was enough to keep most species away. They had fought wars before, many of them, and they had won nearly all of them. They believed they were untouchable. On the morning of what the humans would later call Day 1, the Dreth learned that they were wrong. At exactly the same moment, across 5 separate Dreth star systems spread over dozens of light years, the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace. There was no warning, no advanced scout ships, no signals. 1 second the space around these systems was empty, and the next second it was filled with human warships. 412 of them, divided into 5 strike groups, appearing simultaneously in a coordinated faster-than-light jump that no species in recorded galactic history had ever achieved. The Dreth were caught completely unprepared. Captain Baek Ji-suk led the first strike group directly into the Yorath system, where the Dreth maintained their largest military shipyard. It was a massive complex of orbital stations, construction docks, and fuel depots where new warships were built and old ones repaired. 60 Dreth warships were stationed there for defense. When G-Soak's fleet appeared, the Dreth scrambled to form a battle line, but they were too slow. G-Soak had run this exact scenario 431 times in simulation. He knew what the Dreth would do before they did it. His ships fired first, launching a wave of electronic warfare missiles that flooded Dreth sensor networks with false data. For 90 critical seconds, the Dreth could not tell real ships from phantom targets. In those 90 seconds, G-Soak's vanguard closed the distance and opened fire with everything they had. The battle for Yoreth lasted 6 hours. The Dreth fought hard. They were not cowards, and their ships were well built. But G-Soak's tactics were precise, and his crews were driven by something the Dreth had not expected. It was not just discipline. It was fury, controlled and focused, and aimed like a blade. When the last Dreth warship in the system surrendered, the shipyard complex was in ruins. 38 Dreth warships had been destroyed. 22 had surrendered. G-Soak had lost 11 ships. He did not celebrate. He ordered his fleet to regroup and move to the next target. Across the other 4 systems, the story was the same. Human fleets struck Dreth military installations with overwhelming force and precise coordination. Orbital defense platforms were disabled or captured. Communication relay stations were taken, cutting off the Dreth military's ability to coordinate across their territory. And in every system, every human captain followed the same standing order, issued personally by Admiral Han Do-hyun. The order was simple. Civilian infrastructure is not to be targeted. Civilian ships are not to be fired upon. Civilian populations are not to be harmed. We are not them. It was this order that confused the Dreth most of all. In their long history of warfare, destroying civilian targets was standard practice. It was how you broke a species. It was how you made them surrender. The idea that an enemy could have the power to burn your worlds and choose not to was something the Dreth could not understand. Some Dreth commanders later said that this scared them more than the weapons. By day 4, the outer ring of Dreth military systems had fallen. By day 7, human forces had pushed into the middle territories. Commander Kwon Tae-soon led ground assaults on 3 Dreth fortress worlds, planets that had been turned into heavily defended military bases. The fighting on the ground was brutal. Dreth soldiers were larger, stronger, and covered in natural armor. In open combat, a single Dreth warrior could tear a human apart. But Tae-soon's soldiers did not fight in the open. They fought in tunnels, in corridors, in the tight spaces between fortified walls, where the Dreth's size became a disadvantage. They moved fast, hit hard, and disappeared before the Dreth could respond. They used explosives to collapse defensive positions, and flash grenades to blind the Dreth's heat-sensitive eyes. The first fortress world fell in 40 hours. The second fell in 30. The third surrendered before the assault even began, its commander having watched what happened to the other 2. On day 9, Warlord Gal gathered his remaining core fleet in the Dreth home system. It was the largest collection of Dreth warships in one place. Over 150 ships, including his personal flagship, a massive dreadnought called the Iron Fang. Gal positioned his fleet in a defensive formation around the home planet, and broadcast a message to the approaching human fleet. He called them insects. He called them children. He said they would break against his ships like water against stone. Admiral Do-hyun received the message on the bridge of his command ship. He read it, set it aside, and gave his orders. The final battle began. It was the largest space engagement in over a century. Human ships poured into the system from 3 directions, surrounding the Dreth formation. The fighting was intense and close. Explosions lit up the darkness of space, like new stars being born and dying in seconds. The Dreth fought with everything they had. For a few hours, it seemed like Gal's defensive line might hold. Then Jisok broke through. The Hwasul and its escort ships found a gap in the Dreth formation, a weakness that Jisok had predicted based on Unji's intelligence about Gal's tactical habits. He drove his ships through the gap at full speed, taking fire from both sides, losing 2 escort ships in the process, and came out directly facing the Iron Fang. The Hwasul fired a concentrated barrage at the flagship's engine section. The Iron Fang shuddered, its engines went dark, and it began to drift. Gal's fleet saw their commander's ship go silent. The effect was immediate. Ships began to break formation. Some tried to flee. Some surrendered. Within 3 hours, it was over. Warlord Gal was captured alive aboard the Iron Fang. When human marines breached his command bridge, they found him standing in the center of the room, his clawed hands at his sides. He looked at the humans in their black armor and said nothing. He had nothing left to say. The entire campaign had lasted 11 days. 11 days to dismantle a military empire that had stood for 4,000 years. Across the galaxy, every species with access to a news feed watched in silence. The Galactic Accord Council held an emergency session, but no one knew what to say. The species they had called young, the species they had told to be patient, had just done something that none of them believed was possible. And they had done it without burning a single civilian home. The Galactic Accord Council chamber on Peruim Spire had never been so quiet as the day Yunari returned. The last time she had stood here, the representatives of 42 species had talked over each other, had argued, had shouted at her to come back as she walked out. Now, as she entered through the same tall doors, not a single voice spoke. Every seat was filled. Every eye, sensor, and sensory organ in the room was fixed on the small human woman in the dark gray suit. No one asked her to wait. No one asked her to take a number or submit a formal request to speak. Elder Voron, sitting at the center of the raised platform, simply gestured with one of his 4 arms and gave her the floor immediately. His copper-colored exoskeleton, usually held high with confidence, seemed to sit lower on his frame today. Nari walked to the center of the chamber and stood where she had stood before. She carried no data chip this time. Everyone in the room already knew what had happened. They had watched the reports come in over the past 11 days. They had seen the footage of human fleets appearing from nowhere across 5 systems simultaneously. They had tracked the fall of Dreth military installations one by one. They had heard the final transmission from Warlord Gal's flagship before it went silent. They knew everything, and that knowledge sat in the room like a weight on every chest. Nari spoke clearly, and her words were broadcast not just to the chamber, but to every species with a receiver tuned to the council frequency. She wanted the entire galaxy to hear this. She began with the terms. The Dreth Dominion's military was to be permanently dissolved. Every warship, every weapons platform, every military base would be dismantled. The Dreth would be permitted a small self-defense force for internal security. But they would never again project military power beyond their own borders. Second, Warlord Gal and his command staff would stand trial for the massacre at New Busan. The trial would be conducted by a joint tribunal of human and galactic judges, open to the public, with full evidence presented. Justice would be done, and it would be seen to be done. Third, and this was the part that made the chamber shift uncomfortably, all Dreth civilian worlds would remain untouched and sovereign. Earth claimed no territory. Earth demanded no tribute. Earth took nothing. There was a long pause after she said this. Several alien delegates exchanged looks. The concept was difficult for some of them to process. In galactic history, the winner of a war always took something. Land, resources, population, power. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. But the humans were not taking anything except the dismantling of the weapon that had been used against them. Earth would establish a permanent defense corridor in the Outer Rim sector, where New Busan and other colony worlds were located. This corridor would be patrolled by human warships, and its protection would extend not only to human colonies, but to the colonies of any species in the region. Any attack on any world within the corridor, human or alien, would be treated as an attack on Earth itself. This last point caused a ripple through the chamber. Several smaller species, ones who had lived in fear of larger powers for centuries, sat up straighter. The representative of the Polani, a small avian species whose colonies had been raided by the Dreth 3 times in the past century, lowered his head in what his species used as a gesture of deep gratitude. When Nari finished speaking, she stood still and waited. The chamber was silent for almost a full minute. Then, one by one, the alien representatives began to signal their acknowledgement. Not agreement necessarily, not applause, but acknowledgement. They heard, they understood. The galaxy had changed, and everyone in that room knew it. After the formal session ended, Elder Voron approached Nari in the corridor outside the chamber. He moved slowly, his forearms folded tightly against his body, which was a sign of discomfort in his species. He stood before her and was silent for several seconds before speaking. His voice, usually so measured and commanding, was quieter than she had ever heard it. He told her that the council had failed. He said that when New Busan burned, the council had chosen comfort over justice, stability over truth. He said he understood why humanity had done what it did, even if he wished it had not been necessary. Nari looked up at him. Despite their enormous difference in size, she did not look small. She said, "We did not want your permission, Elder. We wanted you to care. You did not. So we made sure it never happens again." Not to anyone. Voron said nothing. He bowed, a deep and formal bow that he had never given to a human before. And then he turned and walked away. 6 months later, on the surface of New Busan, a memorial was completed. The planet was still scarred, the valleys were still black in places, and the rivers were only beginning to flow again. But in the center of what had once been the capital city of Hanem, a wall of white stone had been built. It was modeled after the memorial in Busan on Earth, but larger. It stretched in a wide curve across an open field, and on it were carved the names of every person who had died. 3.8 million names, each one cut into the stone by hand, by volunteers who had traveled from across human space to do the work. It took 4 months to carve them all. Admiral Han Do-hyun traveled to New Busan for the memorial's dedication. He had retired from active command the week before. He was 58 years old now, and he looked older than that. The campaign had taken something from him that sleep and rest could not restore. He walked along the wall slowly, just as he had walked along the smaller wall in Busan months earlier. He found the names he was looking for: his sister, her husband, their 2 children. He reached into his coat and took out a small photograph. It showed the 4 of them standing in a green field with mountains behind them, smiling. He placed the photograph at the base of the wall, among thousands of others left by other families. He stood there for a while, his hand resting on the stone, and then he turned and walked away without speaking to anyone. The galaxy moved on, as galaxies do. Trade resumed. Diplomacy continued. New alliances formed, and old ones shifted. But something fundamental had changed, and everyone knew it. An alien historian from the Marathi species, writing decades later in a widely read account of the conflict, put it in words that were quoted for centuries after. The humans did not conquer. They did not enslave. They did not take worlds or demand worship. They simply made certain the galaxy understood one truth: harm their people, and no council, no fleet, no empire in the stars will protect you from what comes next. And in the official archives of the Galactic Accord, a footnote was added to the entry on humanity. It was written by an archivist who had been alive during the war and had watched the whole thing unfold. The footnote was short. Following the Dreth conflict, no hostile action was taken against a human world for 300 years. The galaxy had learned. Some lessons, it turned out, only needed to be taught once.